Storytelling is the way our Indigenous friends pass on their knowledge. So today I have a story to share with you. Several of you at Sydenham are part of this story. One day last summer, dressed in my rubber boots and of course my mask, I joined a few other cars parked on a spot on Highway 15. The marker said 1467, and a sign that read, "Walking the Path of Peace Together," and two words in Indigenous language. I walked along the path toward a cabin about 250 meters away, and I saw little signs along the pathway with children's names printed clearly on them. Tiny trees were there as well, with little red flags beside them. They'd been planted along the path. A cluster of children sat in a circle, and toddlers were playing in sandbox and a wooden structure. Parents, volunteers, and instructors could be seen talking and overseeing the activities. I couldn't help but smile as I sat on a log near the fire pit. My thoughts went back to 7 years ago. The land that I was looking at had been a hayfield then. There was only one sign on that land, and it was directing people to a rented space at LaSalle Secondary School where Faith United Church was worshiping. The United Church of Canada had purchased 2.8 acres of land so that a church could be built in Kingston East. That was 32 years ago. However, the Faith congregation chose not to build a bricks and mortar church, but to build a faith community in the east end of Kingston that would focus on outreach. When we at Faith learned that the United Church was planning to dispose of unused property, our minister at the time, Reverend Nan Hudson, asked us to pray about what purpose God might have for the congregation to embrace, for the lands, and God answered our prayers. What follows are a series of events, as I look back, led us on an unbelievable journey. To shorten my story, which could take several hours as Indigenous stories do, I will touch on highlights and ask you to use your imagination and go along with me as I describe the events briefly. The Faith congregation gathered for a workshop led by Nan to consider how we could best use the land for community purposes. Meanwhile, the Truth and Reconciliation and Calls to Action report was released. A couple of Faith members happened to watch Peter Mansbridge interview Gord Downey on CBC. Some of you may have seen that interview. He told the story of Cheney Wenjack and his attempt to go home from a residential school but died on the path. The idea was formed. Could we create a path, along with Indigenous friends, on their land for educational purposes? Maybe a garden. So many ideas were tossed about. We imagined school buses pulling in with children, learning about Indigenous people. However, we couldn't jump ahead. We had to educate ourselves. We created a library similar to the one that I know that Sydenham is or has created, with informational books written by Indigenous people. Our favorite was Richard Wagamiese's, not only his novels, but his meditations. Meanwhile, each week, our minister was meeting over coffee with an Indigenous friend and another friend from Faith, and the three of them met every week. Our relationships with the Indigenous people started with that group and grew and grew and grew. We at Faith were invited to spring and fall festivals, the Strawberry Festival in the spring, and the Maple Syrup Festival in the fall at the Health Center. We joined in circles, enjoyed conversation, drumming, dancing, smudging, and of course, eating. Potluck was great, with a variety of foods, some of which I had never tasted before. But I have to say, as I sit on that log, I thought back how nervous I was, going for the first time into the health center to join that circle. Why was I nervous? I met strange people before, sat with a lot of people, but I was very nervous. What was going on? What was there about me that was making me nervous? As I think back now, I think how silly it was, because there's so many of those people that I met that day are best of friends. Meanwhile, we were meeting with city planners and a local councillor to talk about our hopes and dreams. Our first gathering on the land was on July 1st, 2017. For a joint ceremony, we pledged to work together into the future in a good way. It was exciting to see people arrive and join the circle. Fewer Indigenous folks that day than faith people. But each subsequent year, the number of Indigenous people grew, until the most recent year, we were a small group, but mainly Indigenous. The United Church grant allowed us to engage Three Things consulting firm, and part of their task was to survey Indigenous people to see how they felt about going forward. At the same time, we at Faith were discussing among ourselves and formally how we felt about the project. And it was fantastic to see the results, because our feelings were exactly the same as the feelings of the Indigenous people. I remember the little tags up on the board with all our feelings on it, and then reading the consulting document, which had 4 actions suggested in it. The actions were to create a land council or a land circle, to create shared values and vision, to care for the land together, and for the Indigenous people to create an organization that would have an ongoing relationship with Faith. An exciting event took place. Another highlight, Susan Aglukark, an Inuit singer and motivator, led a workshop and presented a fundraising concert here at the Spire. Never before in Kingston had there been a concert that consisted of, an audience that consisted of 500 people and more, made up of Indigenous people and others in the community, sitting side by side. There are approximately 7,000 Indigenous people living in our city, many undeclared, not declared. Entering a church was the last thing many of them would ever want to do. It wasn't easy for many. Young Elijah Cardinal, a 10-year-old friend whose family has been at services at Faith, co-hosted at times with Nan Hudson at that concert. Sydenham Church people welcomed us and helped us along the way. In 2019, a new sign was erected on the land. The logo was designed by local artist Jaylene Cardinal. You may have seen some of her paintings at Christmas time at the Tourist Bureau outside. They were featured. She's a wonderful artist. She also painted the door on the cabin with a tree of life in the 4-direction circle. I still hear the chug-chug of the drilling machine as the much-needed well was drilled. It was a foggy morning. It seemed almost ethereal. Meanwhile, the Land Council, which met monthly, sent representatives to meet with the Four Winds Consulting Corporation, chaired at that time by Bruce Hutchison, a legal body to secure commitment to allow the initiative to unfold and not see the land turned into housing, condominiums, or strip mall. We now have a draft memo of understanding to this effect. At every stage, funding has been received from the United Church of Canada to live the apology first given in 1986. In addition, Four Winds Presbytery, some local congregations, and many individuals have contributed to help move the initiative forward. While sitting on that log last summer and hearing the children's voices, seeing the little trees, I knew that I will not live, and I know that I will not live for the 20 years to see the results of the labor of love. But the children will, and that's what matters. Thank you. My friend Pat has some beautiful slides and a short presentation to follow.
In the spring of 2020, a garden was created. This large undertaking was spearheaded by Faith's Tom Walton, with much work done by Kathleen Walton and members of Faith and the Land Council. Several vegetable beds were created. Kimberly DeBasiage held ceremony, and Michelle Webb planted a medicine bed of tobaccos and sweetgrass. Over the summer, large quantities of vegetables were grown and donated to food sharing organizations. Several more trees were planted and a garden shed was installed. The Land Council had been having monthly dinner meetings for years, but with the coming of COVID, our meetings halted and we met infrequently online. But in 2021 and the retirement of Reverend Nan Hudson came a time of transition for the Land Council. Since January 2021, the activities on the land have been Indigenous-led. As Maureen Buchanan, member of the Land Council and Kingston Indigenous Languages Nest, volunteered to coordinate the work on the land with the help of members of the local Indigenous communities. The Land Council created a transition working group to focus the work of the Greater Land Council in the areas of repatriation, biodiversity, Indigenous resurgence, and caring for the land. The working group is comprised of 3 co-chairs, Maureen Buchanan, Ojibwe, Laura Klotz Johnson, Mohawk, and myself, Pat Roebuck from Faith United Church. Our secretary and treasurer is Lynn Freeman from Sydenham Street United Church. The United Church currently owns the land, which is in the process of repatriation to an Indigenous incorporated nonprofit charitable organization. There continues to be collaborative work toward this goal. All work on the land itself is done within the Indigenous worldview of all our relations. In this view, our relations are not just our family, but all of creation, including humans, animals, and plants. This view promotes caring for and responsibility to the world around us. The work of the garden that was begun in 2020 continued in 2021. With Indigenous leadership, it became the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden. The circle has widened as many more people from both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities joined in. Vegetable gardens were expanded, the medicine bed doubled, and the 3 sisters and pollination beds were created. Ladies from Faith researched native species and planted native flowers and grasses in the front gardens. About 1,000 trees were planted that year. It started on Earth Day with the planting of tiny nut trees and continued with the creation of a fruit guild, a hedgerow of berry bushes and small trees, as well as dozens of other trees. The biggest project was the planting of the Little Forests. Our approach to Little Forests was inspired by Dr. Akira Miyawaki. If you leave the land alone, it returns to forest in about 150 to 200 years. planting a little forest condenses the time to 15 to 20 years. In the spring, work began to prepare the soil for the fall planting. First, the area was mowed, and then work bees were held to layer the ground with cardboard, straw, mulch, and wood chips. Over the summer, other vegetative matter was added to encourage the growth of microbes to create healthy soil for the young trees. In the fall, we planted 900 uplands and lowlands trees and shrubs comprised of 49 different native species. It took a coordinated effort with a grid system and people trained to guide other volunteers through systematic planting. It took several work bees to accomplish this mammoth task. There were also many opportunities for learning, playing, and socializing on the land. Members of the community built structures which enriched the space. This included a sandbox, benches that morphed into tables, and a climbing structure which is supported by enormous sections of downed willow. There was also an open structure built to organize firewood and other materials. And a trellis shade structure is well underway and will be completed in the spring. There were many learning opportunities focused on the Indigenous community. The Language Nest held 2 series of programs focused on young Indigenous children. One was held in the summer and the second in the fall. Both were coordinated by an Indigenous early childhood educator with an outdoor education focus. They were morning gatherings for little children and their parents and included kindergarten readiness activities and culture-based outdoor programming focused on storytelling. Indigenous language activities, outdoor structured and unstructured play, ceremonial practices, and gardening. Some of the partners involved were Kingston Frontenac Public Library, Kingston Community Health Center, and Limestone District School Board's Indigenous education team. There were also many learning activities which included the Greater Kingston community. These were coordinated by a group of 5 Indigenous women. For example, the 8-week Pollinators Workshop that met once a week, open to all ages and kid-friendly. There was gathering, ceremony, song, and Indigenous language activities, after which people had a choice of crafts, caring for and harvesting the garden, and contributing to the beadwork on the one dish, one spoon wampum. The Kingston Public Library was there, and a meal of local foods was provided by the Loving Spoonful. There were also several one-session workshops, such as the Corn and Seed Saving Workshop, where participants were served a meal of traditional foods and learned about Indigenous planting practices, seed saving techniques, and the importance of heritage seeds to foster biodiversity. There was also a leather craft station and opportunity to harvest food to take home. We also hosted quite a few school field trips. Each group started their session in a circle, learning about all our relations and the importance of developing relationships with the world around us, including humans, other animals, and plants. They then chose activities that ranged from preparing the garden for winter, planting trees, and spreading leaves and wood chips. There was time for exploring and playing. Each session ended in circle with an invitation to stop by again to connect with the land they had cared for that day. There have been literally hundreds of people contributing to the land, from Indigenous communities, Faith United Church, the Language Nest, Little Forest Kingston, Loving Spoonful, the Sweetgrass Circle from Kingston Secondary School, school field trips, and corporations such as Cogeco and Starbucks, as well as interested individuals from the Kingston region. There were master gardeners and those with experience in water management. Some other volunteer jobs included mowing, planting, watering, consulting, preparing the soil, building, maintaining equipment, and the baking of snacks. Building on what we've learned over the past years, we are planning ahead. Water has been a challenge as the exposed, windy location dries the soil, and we have to use the generator frequently to water the gardens. Now that the trees are planted, they too will need to be watered. Currently, there is a group of Queen's engineering students looking at ways to capture and distribute the water, as well as options for solar power to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. The trellis shade structure will also serve to collect rainwater. A group of Indigenous women is planning and organizing the garden for this coming summer, working with the Loving Spoonful. And we are planning another little forest for 2023. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action: churches are asked to support community-controlled healing and reconciliation projects, community-controlled culture and language revitalization projects, and community-controlled education and relationship building projects. There will continue to be lots of opportunity for the Indigenous communities, members of faith, and the Greater Kingston to join in the workshops, caring for the gardens and trees, as well as just coming by to visit the land. We hope to see you there.